560 The Answer.
Get the latest weather, traffic, and news updates online at 560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. We're going to get to the recent revelations about those self-styled civil libertarians, thanks to a document declassified by DNI Tulsi Gabbard about Biden's plans to monitor individuals that they believe to be potential threats to the public. John Lott, and we will discuss that with John Lott momentarily. But first, I wanted to raise the specter of this new book by the director of the University of Chicago Crime Lab called Unforgiving Places. His name is Jans Ludwig. He's an economist. And he suggests that some of the conventional wisdom about gun violence is incorrect. One of the things he did was look at two neighborhoods that are divided between the West and South Side. 71st and Dorchester on the South Side, the boundary between Greater Grand Crossing on the west side of the street and South Shore on the east side of the street. Twice as many shootings in Greater Grand Crossing on the west side of the street as across the street in South Shore. And he argues that conventional wisdom basically gives us no understanding of why, because the neighborhoods are economically similar and demographically similar. Obviously the same gun laws. He says, does Ludwig, we all tend to think of gun violence as being basically gang wars over drug-selling turf, deliberate, premeditated. It's got an objective, has some sort of economic motivation. But that's not what most shootings in America are. Most shootings are actually garden-variety arguments that escalate and spin out of control and end in tragedy because someone's got a gun. And it turns out that there are features of these two neighborhoods that lead arguments to be more likely to happen in Greater Grand Crossing and more likely to escalate and end in tragedy. He makes the point that in South Shore, you have people around. There are a bunch of eyes on the street because it's right along the lake. Historically, there were a lot of commercial buildings interspersed with residential, so there are always people walking around. In Greater Grand Crossing, there's just a lot less commercial development. There's a lot fewer eyes on the street. There's more disorder, more graffiti, more trash lying around, and there's more premature mortality. He says, so it's not that people are fundamentally different. It's not that the economic conditions are different. It's that you're more under stress in Greater Grand Crossing, so you're more likely to go on tilt. And there are fewer adults around to step in and de-escalate when that happens. He suggests that there is data to support that there are maybe some simple ways to make a big difference on gun violence. They don't require a ton of money, and they don't require to have huge political fights or solve every other social problem before we can get to gun violence. The sort of new behavioral economic perspective on gun violence suggests very different sorts of social programs that people have not been talking about. We've seen in study after study, says Ludwig, that they're not very expensive. They don't take tons of time. You can deliver them inside schools, inside detention facilities at very low cost. They have really big impacts in reducing people's risk of going on tilt, as he describes it, and getting involved in violence. And I think the other thing we can do is eyes on the street. That's a very solvable problem. One of the ways you can do that is by making pocket parks, he argues, in areas where there is a significant number of vacant lots. You make public spaces that the public accesses, and you have more eyes on the street. He said in Philadelphia, those so-called pocket parks can reduce the number of shootings around an area by 20 to 30%. Just by bringing more people into the public, more eyes on the street. He doesn't go into detail, at least in this interview that I read, about some of these other programs that deal, that can be delivered in schools and detention facilities that help to prevent people from, quote unquote, going on tilt. But this is what he's talking about in terms of it's sort of, it's a maturity, dispute resolution orientation deal more so than than gang warfare, at least in terms of where the biggest impact can be had the most quickly. Interesting. Glad we have John Lott on to address that. John Lott is the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, former senior advisor for research and stats at the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Policy, and author of books including Gun Control Myths and More Guns, Less Crime. John, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's good to talk to you again.
What do you think about that assessment by that University of Chicago dude?
I don't know what to say other than it's probably the typical left-wing stuff. Look, 90% of murderers have a violent criminal record. These are not normal people who just get into an argument and lose their cool and shoot somebody. And beyond that, there's a famous criminologist named James Q. Wilson who had a theory about broken windows, which basically said that, if you have an area where people aren't around, you're going to be more likely to have more crime. One of the reasons to enforce simple laws that you have there, like graffiti and broken windows and things like that, was to make sure that people would feel comfortable being out and around. So it's not that part isn't a new idea, wanting to go and but Jens doesn't seem to want to give James Q. Wilson credit for having that. And there is empirical evidence for that. But this notion, look, murders in the United States are very heavily concentrated in tiny areas. 2% of the counties in the United States make up over 52% of the murders. And if you ever look at what's called a murder map for those counties, you'll find that about 2/3 of those murders occur within 10-block areas. So what's unique about the United States compared to other countries is how incredibly heavily concentrated murders are in the United States in relatively small areas. And they are gang-related. One of the reasons why this 90% of murderers have a violent criminal record is because they're overwhelmingly gang members to begin with. And so, some of the stuff, people just don't understand some of the data. So like you'll hear, for example, that half of murderers are acquaintances. Well, when people hear the term acquaintance, they just think people who are friendly with each other. But the problem is that most gang members know
each other.
Of other gangs.
Yeah, I'm acquainted with them and I want to kill them. Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
But police know who they are, too. I mean, they know who's going to be committing the crimes and who's going to be committing the murders.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, the point is, these guys have criminal records. They've been through the system multiple times. They've been caught. The police have had to process them before. So it's not just your regular person. I mean, they just want to make it appear that it's just somebody who kind of just loses their cool and goes and starts shooting up other people. And so you should be worried about everybody who's around you because anybody could be a danger. And this has been the long-term gun control argument that's there. But in fact, that's extremely misleading. I mean, you should be worried about people who have violent criminal records.
Yeah, and not turning them out without in a no cash bail system. But I digress. I wanted to get to the piece that you penned for Real Clear Politics as well, because you're right, and you mentioned this in your piece, that this is an underreported story, and it's particularly salient right now as you have all these leftists running around pretending to be civil libertarians, aghast at, for example, that Judge Dugan in Wisconsin being charged with obstruction of justice because, if the facts are as presented, because she obstructed justice. But they were all party to a plan under the Biden administration that would make an honest civil libertarian Blanche, weren't they?
Yeah, look, there had been an initial report that had been made public by the Biden administration in June 2021 dealing with domestic terrorists, where they were talking about going after people who had engaged in criminal actions. What Tulsi Gabbard just declassified was kind of the complete report, and it had discussions about how they just weren't going to be going after people who were engaged in criminal actions. They were going to go after people who were explicitly saying in non-criminal actions, what they called concerning non-criminal actions. And when you read this, it's just startling. So, people remember when whistleblowers from the FBI would come out and say that they were going after Catholics, infiltrating Catholic groups, or going and taking the license plate numbers down for people who had been to school board meetings. And when that leak came out, the Biden administration said, oh, well, we're just concentrating on people who are engaged in criminal actions. Well, when you actually read what Tulsi Gabbard declassified, it's clear that, in fact, that wasn't the case. They were going after people simply because of their political views. So when they go and say things like there was a FBI leak that had this guide for FBI agents to help identify terrorists based on whether they use symbols like 2A or use the Betsy Ross flag, the one with the circle with the stars, or have put on their social media posts the right to keep and bear arms. Those were symbols and sayings that the FBI was supposed to use to identify people who, as an initial thing for criminal actions. Well, it turns out that it was much broader than that. They were using these to identify people simply on the basis of their political views that they had there. And, it's just kind of startling to me. I don't think I've ever seen a government kind of use these resources to identify and tag people based simply on whether their political views align with the administration or not.
Well, I mean, I can't say that I'm terribly surprised because of the other examples you gave. I mean, this just makes it more of a comprehensive approach, so it can't be just dismissed as a one-off, a rogue agent in the Richmond, Virginia office. Yeah, right. The philosophy of the left is that you should be prosecuted for your thoughts and exonerated for your behavior, so long as, at least on the behavior side, so long as you're a fellow traveler. I mean, that's what we see playing out right now with these judges, don't we?
Well, I mean, what's particularly startling is that they didn't just identify people with this. One of the things that came out was what they call debanking, basically putting pressure on financial institutions not to go and do business with certain people that the administration would identify as being, quote, concerning non-criminal behavior. And we had lawyers, for example, that worked with Trump after the 2020 election. I mean, you can disagree with, whether there was vote fraud in the 2020 election, but for a lawyer to be hired by Trump to advise him on what he can do and what he can't do, that's not criminal action by the lawyer. Lawyers get hired by people all the time, and they're supposed to provide their best advice. But yeah, you had people like John Eastman, who was a lawyer for Trump, who had his bank accounts at Bank of America and USAA closed. He had no recourse there. I mean, try running your life without being able to go and have checks, without being able to go and have a credit card, without being able to go and have a bank account. I mean, you can go to payday people and go and cash checks that you get and just live your life with cash. But that makes things a lot more difficult for people to go and have to operate like that. And, when you read this thing, they said, basically people that we were identifying as having this concerning non-criminal behavior, they wanted to make essentially it difficult for those individuals to operate. That's explicitly in the document that was declassified by Tulsi Gabbard that's there. It explains why a number of people, for who were Catholics who had their bank accounts closed, and others, which is otherwise inexplicable, because they were engaged in no criminal activity, why they were facing this debanking during the Biden administration.
Right, and then it certainly prompts the question, oh, is this like how the censorship industrial complex worked? We're not going to pass any legislation or attempt to pass any legislation, partly because it would have been unconstitutional. So what we're going to do is just come up with this approach, and then we're going to whisper to our friends at the big banks like we did at big tech to get them to do for us what we can't do for ourselves.
Right. I mean, Obama had Operation Choke Point, where he would go and put pressure on financial institutions not to go and do business with oil companies or with firearm makers or whatever. Trump ended that. Biden reinstituted it. But then he expanded it beyond just going after companies that he didn't like. He's ended up going after individuals that had the wrong types of political views in order to make their lives more difficult and make it harder for them to go and speak out or operate in the world there. And so, it's, and with regard to the tech censorship, one of the things that was clear in the declassified thing that Tulsi Gabbard released was that the Biden administration wanted to take the world lead in terms of this type of censorship. I mean, they say a couple times in there that they want to protect people's freedom of expression. But then there's like a dozen times when they talk about going after disinformation and making sure that disinformation isn't allowed to spread. They talk about things like using the public education system in order to create a resiliency for young people to withstand disinformation that's out there. One can only try to wonder to what extent they were willing to go and put out their own disinformation on things. But there's this thing called the Christchurch, I can't remember the full name, but after the mosque shooting in
New Zealand,
in New Zealand. And one of the things that if you read the documents there, they're talking about going after what they call hate speech. And the Biden administration wanted to make that kind of the lead thing that they were saying. I mean, who's going to define what hate speech is? I may disagree with somebody. I mean, as long as they're not threatening violence, which would be a criminal thing, but given that they're talking about non-criminal activity here, if I say I dislike somebody or I think somebody's wrong, according to the Biden administration, those types of things could theoretically be hate speech there. And do we want the government to go and put pressure on tech companies to try to make sure that they don't publish or allow people to disseminate things that others disagree with politically?
John Lott, president of the Crime Prevention Research Center, former senior advisor for research and stats at the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Policy, and author of books including Gun Control Myths and More Guns, Less Crime. John, thank you as always.
Thank you for being there.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
There's only one radio show in Chicago talking about today's biggest stories and telling you what they really mean. That show is this one, Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer. Gain insight into building strong marriages and raising godly children with Focus on the Family with Jim Daly each weekday at 11:30 a.m. on our sister station, AM 1160, Hope for Your Life.
Patrick was way behind on his IRS taxes.
I was in way over my head. The total amount ended up being somewhere just over $30,000. $30,000.
Then the IRS came to collect.
Started getting letter after letter. A lien had been filed against me. They were going to basically hang me completely out to dry.
He had to do something.
That's when I reached out to Optima Tax Relief.
Patrick's life quickly got a lot easier.
It was very easy, pretty much hands off. They picked up the ball and ran with it.
And how'd it go?
I couldn't believe it. I had to ask like 2 or 3 times. I saved an incredible amount of money.
How does Patrick feel about Optima?
Couldn't be happier. They definitely helped me. Optima Tax Relief, the best place to call. They're the best in the business.
Do what Patrick did and call Optima.